Imagine waking up one morning and realizing that the world you trusted, the routines, the security, the belief that tomorrow would be better, had vanished overnight. For millions of Americans in the early 1930s, this wasn't a metaphor, it was reality. A slow, creeping uncertainty settled over towns and cities until one day it became impossible to ignore. Something had broken, and no one knew how or if it could be repaired. The Great Depression did not simply arrive, it descended. It crept into the lives of ordinary families first, as whispers, then as newspaper headlines, and finally as empty wallets, shuttered shops, and voices filled with fear. But to understand what everyday Americans felt, we must go back to the moment the ground began to shake. October 29, 1929, the day investors would later call Black Tuesday. Wall Street had danced on the edge of a cliff for years. Credit flowed freely. Optimism ran wild. Radios advertised easy riches. People believed the modern world had conquered the old cycles of boom and bust. But all it took was one violent panic on the trading floor, one avalanche of sell orders, and suddenly the impossible became the inevitable. Billions of dollars of value evaporated in hours. Newspapers struggled to capture the scale of the disaster. The stock market crash didn't just bruise the economy, it shattered confidence in the entire system. Yet the most painful truth is that the crash itself wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. By 1930, factories began to close. Banks, once trusted cornerstones of local communities, locked their doors forever as panicked depositors lined up outside. Each failure sent aftershocks across the country. When a bank collapsed, families lost not just their savings, they lost their future. A lifetime of work reduced to nothing more than scraps of paper. Unemployment rose at a speed the nation had never seen. By 1933, 1 in 4 American workers had no job at all. 16 million people, desperate for work, desperate for stability, desperate for a chance to feed their children. And unemployment wasn't evenly distributed. Entire towns in the Midwest, built around a single factory or mill, watched their only source of income disappear. In mining regions of West Virginia and Kentucky, men stood outside idle shafts with nowhere left to go. In cities like Detroit, the sound of assembly lines faded into silence. For many men, proud, hard-working, raised with the belief that providing for one's family was a sacred duty, the shame was unbearable. Some left their homes rather than face their children at the dinner table with empty pockets. These men became part of a new, heartbreaking phenomenon: hobos riding freight trains across the country. They clung to the sides of boxcars, jumped between moving rail cars, dodged railroad detectives, and risked death for even the smallest chance of finding temporary work hundreds of miles away. Some found day labor on farms or odd jobs in rail yards. Many found nothing. Meanwhile, those who remained employed were hardly lucky. Factories slashed wages by 30%, 40%, even 60%. A paycheck that once supported a family comfortably now barely covered a week of food. Working men stayed in jobs not because they were safe, but because there was nowhere else to go. The fear of losing everything created a silent pressure that weighed on workers like a stone. They kept their heads down, accepted pay cuts, and prayed the factory doors would still open the next morning. And then came the disaster that nature itself brought to the table. In the Great Plains, Texas, Oklahoma, Kansas, Colorado, and New Mexico, land that had once been dark and rich turned dry and brittle. Years of aggressive plowing had stripped away the protective grasses that anchored the soil. When drought struck in the early 1930s, the earth simply broke apart. Winds lifted the soil into the air and carried it for hundreds of miles. Families watched noon turn to midnight as towering black clouds of dust rolled across the horizon. Children tied wet cloth around their mouths. Mothers stuffed rags under door frames to keep dirt from piling up on kitchen tables. Cattle starved. Farmhouses filled with dust so fine it coated eyelashes and settled in lungs. This wasn't a single storm. It was a constant invasion. The Dust Bowl became one of the worst environmental disasters in American history. Fields died, towns emptied, and hundreds of thousands of families, many of them small farmers, packed everything they owned onto old trucks and fled west. They became known as Okies, though they came from more than just Oklahoma. They were Americans searching for survival, hoping California's fertile valleys might offer the fresh start the plains could no longer give. The photographs from this period tell the truth better than any statistics. Worn faces, children with dust on their cheeks, mothers staring into the distance, unsure of how to protect their families. These images, captured by Dorothea Lange and others, became the nation's mirror, revealing not weakness, but resilience in the face of crushing hardship. Yet even in the darkest days, people found ways to hold on. Neighbors shared food. Families combined households. Churches opened their doors. Communities united in ways that today feel almost impossible to imagine. In towns across America, people who had little still found something to give. This was not just an economic crisis. It was a test of the American spirit. And the question remained, how do you rebuild a nation where so many have lost so much? In the next chapter, we'll step inside the homes of the 1930s, where ordinary families discovered that survival wasn't just about money. It was about ingenuity, sacrifice, and a sense of unity that held them together when everything else seemed to fall apart. For families across the Great Plains, the 1930s were not simply difficult years. They were years when the very earth beneath their feet seemed to turn against them. Imagine living in a place where each sunrise carried a question. Would the sky bring another storm of dust, another layer of suffocating soil coating the kitchen floor, another reminder that the land your family had farmed for generations was no longer a partner in survival, but an enemy? That was the daily reality for millions living through the Dust Bowl, one of the most devastating environmental catastrophes in American history. When the rains disappeared and the winds strengthened, farmers at first believed the drought would pass quickly. They had seen dry seasons before, but nothing had prepared them for this. With prairie grasses long plowed under in pursuit of booming wheat prices, the soil had nothing to hold it down. What followed were storms so massive and so dark that people called them black blizzards. Dust would roll across the plains like a living wall, thousands of feet tall, sweeping across counties in minutes. Daylight vanished. Children were rushed inside. Lamps were lit at noon. And inside those homes, families sealed windows with wet cloth, swept piles of dirt from tabletops, shook grit from blankets, and prayed the storm would pass before someone fell ill. Dust pneumonia became an ever-present threat. Doctors saw lungs filled not with fluid, but with soil. Schools closed on days when visibility was so low that children couldn't see the road. Some towns even held dirt drives, where residents shoveled dust off the streets like snow. It was an enemy that never rested, always returned, and made no distinction between the rich and the poor. As the storms continued, crops failed year after year. Fields that once blossomed with promise now grew nothing but despair. Wells dried up. Livestock died where they stood. Bankers came to foreclose on farms that had been in families for decades. And with each passing month, more families faced the same impossible choice: stay and lose everything, or leave and hope the road west held something better. For hundreds of thousands, the decision was made with heavy hearts. They gathered what little they had left, a few tools, some clothing, maybe a mattress tied to the roof of an aging truck, and began the long journey toward California. Their cars were often patched together with scrap metal, wire, and determination. These weren't vacations or casual moves. They were migrations born of desperation. Parents reassured their children that things would get better, even when they themselves weren't sure. These migrants came to be called Okies, though they came not only from Oklahoma, but from Kansas, Texas, Colorado, and Arkansas. The term was often used dismissively and cruelly, but the people it described were far more resilient than their critics understood. They drove west along Route 66, a road that became a symbol of hope and heartbreak. Gas stations along the highway saw endless lines of weary families. Campgrounds turned into makeshift communities, clusters of tents, tin shacks, and small fires where strangers became neighbors, sharing stories and scraps of food. California, in the collective imagination, was a promised land, a place of fruit orchards, fertile soil, and endless opportunity. But the reality waiting for migrants was far harsher. Officials estimated that more than 300,000 Dust Bowl refugees arrived during the decade, and California simply wasn't ready. Jobs were scarce. Pay was meager. Farmers, seeing desperate workers arrive by the truckload, dropped wages to pennies. Families sometimes worked 12-hour days picking cotton or fruit, earning too little to buy a full meal. Whole communities sprang up in the fields, rows of tents and makeshift shacks made of cardboard, plywood, and whatever else families could find. These camps had no running water, no electricity, no sanitation. Families bathed in nearby creeks, cooked over open fires, and hoped the next harvest would bring a job that lasted longer than a day or two. For many, these camps became a permanent home because there was simply nothing else. But out of this hardship came some of the most powerful records of American history. Photographers sent by the federal government, among them Dorothea Lange, Arthur Rothstein, and Walker Evans, traveled the camps, documenting the lives of the displaced. Their photos didn't just capture poverty, they captured humanity. The furrowed brows of fathers searching for work, the determined gaze of mothers protecting their children, the silent worry etched onto faces that had weathered far too many storms. Lange's iconic photograph, Migrant Mother, became the face of the era, a testament to endurance, dignity, and quiet strength. Writers, too, told the migrants' story. John Steinbeck, inspired by what he witnessed in California's fields, wrote The Grapes of Wrath, a novel that laid bare the suffering, exploitation, and courage of Dust Bowl families. Although controversial when first published, it awakened many Americans to the crisis unfolding in their own backyard. Steinbeck's characters were fictional, but their journey was painfully real. And yet, even in these harshest conditions, families found ways to hold on to hope. Children played with homemade toys, crafted from wire or carved wood. Parents taught their children to read using torn pages from old magazines. Churches held services in fields, using overturned crates as pews. Music carried families through long nights. Harmonicas, battered guitars, and voices singing old hymns that had comforted generations before them. The Dust Bowl migration was not just an environmental tragedy, it was a test of national conscience. How would America respond to its own displaced citizens? How would communities treat the desperate? How would a government long reluctant to intervene in economic life now act in the face of mass suffering? The answers would shape the next decade. In the midst of heartbreak and exhaustion, hope arrived, not as a sudden miracle, but as a slow and determined change in policy. A new era was beginning, one that would redefine the relationship between the American people and their government. But before the nation could rebuild, families first had to learn how to survive each day inside their own homes, with less money, fewer resources, and challenges they had never imagined. In the next chapter, We step inside those homes to see how ordinary Americans transformed hardship into resilience and survival into a way of life. If the Dust Bowl and the crash of 1929 shattered America from the outside, then the real war for survival was fought inside its homes. For millions of families, the house became both a refuge and a battleground, the one place where the storms of unemployment, hunger, and uncertainty had to be kept at bay through sheer willpower and relentless ingenuity. While the nation struggled, mothers and fathers turned their kitchens, living rooms, and backyards into command centers of survival. In these homes, every dollar had a destination, every scrap had a purpose. Nothing, absolutely nothing, was wasted. For many families, the Great Depression marked the first time they experienced true scarcity. It wasn't just about cutting back, it was about reinventing daily life. Parents who had once bought bread at the store now baked it themselves. Clothing that would have been discarded in better years was carefully patched, restitched, and repurposed until the fabric was more mending than original cloth. A tear wasn't a reason to buy something new. It was a challenge to overcome. Women, in particular, carried enormous responsibility. They were the center of the household economy, forced to stretch every meal, every yard of fabric, every ounce of fuel. A mother in the 1930s was more than a homemaker. She was a manager, a strategist, and often the emotional anchor of the entire family. She rationed food, repaired clothing, managed scarce money, soothed the anxieties of her children, and reassured her husband that things would get better. In many ways, the sacrifice and resilience of women during this era became one of the defining, though often unspoken, stories of the Depression. Daily routines changed dramatically. Monday was wash day, and for most families that meant scrubbing clothes by hand. Washing machines existed, but they were luxuries far beyond what ordinary people could afford. Women filled metal tubs with water heated on wood-burning stoves, scrubbed each garment on a rough washboard, wrung them out by hand, and hung them outside to dry. Tuesday became ironing day. But irons were heavy blocks of cast iron heated directly on the stove. A woman's arms would ache from lifting the iron again and again, carefully smoothing each shirt, knowing her family needed their clothes to last as long as possible. Healthcare also became a privilege. For minor illnesses, families relied on home remedies, ointments made from herbs, mustard plasters for chest colds, saltwater gargles, boiled onions for coughs. A trip to the doctor was a decision made only when absolutely necessary. Even dental visits were rare. Some families couldn't afford toothpaste, so they brushed with baking soda, salt, or even crushed charcoal. Mothers used whatever knowledge they had, passed down from their own parents, to nurse their families without the help of professionals. Childbirth brought its own challenges. Hospital deliveries were expensive. So many women relied on midwives or experienced neighbors. Births took place in bedrooms, lit by the soft glow of kerosene lamps. Family members boiled water, gathered clean linens, and prayed for the safety of both mother and child. These moments of life and death unfolded quietly behind closed doors, unseen by the world, but deeply felt by the families living them. Heating a home during winter required yet another layer of creativity. Fuel was expensive, so families gathered fallen branches or chopped scrap wood. Some even burned corn cobs or dried weeds to heat their homes. Instead of warming the entire house, they concentrated on a single room, often the kitchen, where the stove provided both heat and a place to cook. At night, the whole family slept together under piles of blankets, sharing body heat. What might look uncomfortable to us today was, for them, a simple act of practicality and love. Clothing shortages led to an entire culture of repurposing. Flour sacks, printed with colorful patterns by thoughtful manufacturers, became dresses for young girls. Old coats were taken apart and restitched into smaller sizes for the younger children. Socks were darned so many times that the original thread was barely recognizable. Shoes were patched with cardboard or with rubber cut from worn-out tires. Pride didn't vanish, but it took on a new form: the pride of making something last. Food, of course, shaped much of daily life. Families planned meals carefully, focusing on simple, filling staples. Beans, potatoes, rice, cabbage, and stale bread became daily necessities. Meat was a luxury many could rarely afford. Women learned how to stretch a meal across several days. Leftover vegetables became soup. Bones became broth. Nothing edible went into the trash. Home gardens grew in empty backyard corners, with tomatoes, squash, onions, and beans sprouting wherever a patch of soil could be found. City dwellers used vacant lots or window boxes to grow what they could. Families adapted emotionally, too. Pride gave way to practicality. Multi-generational households became common, with grandparents, aunts, uncles, and cousins all living together under one roof to save on rent and utilities. This created crowded homes, but it also created companionship and mutual support. After all, loneliness was another enemy of the Depression, and living together helped keep despair at bay. Despite the hardships, there were moments of tenderness and even joy. Families gathered around tables not just to eat, but to talk, tell stories, and remind one another that better days would come. Children invented games from sticks, marbles, and bits of string. Parents found comfort in simple rituals like reading aloud, listening to the radio when they could afford electricity, or playing cards by lamplight. It wasn't the life they had known before, but it was a life sustained by determination, creativity, and an unshakable belief in one another. The American home of the 1930s was not a place of despair. It was a place of defiance, a quiet, persistent refusal to surrender to circumstances. Families adapted because they had no choice, but they endured because they chose to. And within those four walls, often worn and weathered, the spirit of survival was passed from parent to child day after day. In the next chapter, we will explore how, despite unrelenting hardships, people found ways to smile, laugh, dream, and connect. Entertainment, whether a crackling radio broadcast or a borrowed board game, became a lifeline that helped Americans hold on to hope when so much around them seemed uncertain. In a decade defined by hunger, unemployment, and relentless uncertainty, it would be easy to imagine that joy simply vanished from American life. Yet even in the harshest years of the Great Depression, people held tightly to small sparks of happiness, moments of connection, laughter, and escape that allowed them to forget, even briefly, the weight of daily survival. Entertainment didn't just distract people during the 1930s, it kept them human. It reminded them that life was more than hardship. And in countless homes across the nation, those moments of light became the glue that held families together. Before the Depression, going to the movies was one of the most beloved pastimes in America. Theaters had been booming throughout the 1920s, offering glamorous musicals, daring adventure films, and the new excitement of talking pictures. But when the economy collapsed, even a few cents for a ticket felt extravagant. More than a third of the nation's movie theaters closed their doors. Once crowded auditoriums, lit by glowing marquees, went silent. For many towns, the darkened theater was a symbol of just how much had been lost. Still, there were moments when the magic returned. Some theaters introduced bank nights, raffle drawings with cash prizes to attract locals who couldn't afford tickets. Families sometimes saved for weeks just to watch a single film together. When they finally did go, The theater offered a temporary escape, stories of adventure, romance, and comedy that transported audiences far from their worries. Shirley Temple's bright smile, Fred Astaire's elegant dancing, and the slapstick antics of the Marx Brothers gave the country hope during its bleakest years. But the true centerpiece of entertainment in the 1930s wasn't the theater, it was the radio. The radio became the beating heart of the American home. Even families who couldn't afford new clothes or repairs found ways to pay for electricity just to keep the radio running. It sat proudly on a table or shelf, its wooden frame polished to a shine. When the dial glowed and a familiar voice crackled through the speakers, the whole family would gather close, leaning in to catch every word. Morning programs offered home makers a brief break from chores, melodramatic soap operas, household tips, and gentle music that floated through the kitchen. Children raced home from school to listen to adventure stories filled with daring heroes and cliffhanger endings. For teenagers and young adults, radio introduced swing music, jazz, and the voices of big band stars who brought rhythm and excitement into even the most modest house. Evenings belonged to the whole family. They listened to presidential fireside chats, gripping mysteries, live performances, and comedy shows that made households erupt in laughter. The radio connected people not just to entertainment, but to each other. When millions tuned in simultaneously, the nation felt united, even if listeners were separated by thousands of miles and entirely different circumstances. For those without radios, or on nights when families simply wanted to enjoy each other's company, homegrown entertainment flourished. Board games became a staple of American life. The game, Sorry, captured families' imagination, offering simple rules and endless hours of play. But the most iconic board game of the era was Monopoly. Released in the early 1930s, the game became a sensation precisely because real money was scarce. Players reveled in buying property, collecting rent, and imagining a world in which wealth could be created by rolling dice. Ironically, a game about money became a symbol of hope for families who had none. Card games, too, filled long evenings. Children learned to play rummy and go fish. Adults taught each other bridge and poker. The stakes were rarely money. Pride, fun, and the simple joy of winning were enough. Families played by the light of oil lamps when electricity was too expensive or unreliable. The flickering glow made the moments feel intimate, even magical. Outside the home, people searched for inexpensive ways to enjoy fresh air and companionship. Mini-golf exploded in popularity, with more than 30,000 courses across the country at the height of the trend. For just a few cents, families could laugh, compete, and escape the weight of their daily struggles. Parks filled with picnickers. Lakes and rivers attracted swimmers during the summer months. Churches organized gatherings and community nights that offered music, food, and fellowship. Despite the hardships, people found joy not only in structured entertainment, but in the simple act of being together. Families told stories, sang old songs, and created small traditions that became cherished memories. Neighbors visited one another, sharing gossip, jokes, and the comfort of company. In a world without smartphones, television, or constant distraction, connection was personal, face-to-face, voice-to-voice, heart-to-heart. The Depression tested America's resilience, but it also revealed its spirit. Laughter still echoed through kitchens. Music still drifted from open windows. Children still played in dusty yards, their imaginations turning sticks into airplanes or heroes. And when life felt too heavy to carry alone, people carried it together. Entertainment during the 1930s wasn't merely a luxury. It was a lifeline, a reminder that happiness could still be found in the smallest of places. A shared game, a radio song, a story told in the dark. These moments strengthened families and gave them the emotional endurance they needed to face another day. In the next chapter, we'll explore how communities, churches, charities, and the federal government stepped in to help rebuild a nation shaken to its core. From soup kitchens to bold new programs, America began to discover that surviving a crisis required not only individual strength, but collective action. By the mid-1930s, America was a country exhausted. After years of layoffs, foreclosures, collapsing farms, dust storms, hunger, and endless searching for work, the nation had reached a breaking point. People had survived as best they could within their homes and communities. But the scale of suffering had grown too large for any family, any town, or any private charity to handle alone. Something bigger had to change. The crisis had become too vast, too relentless, and too deeply woven into the fabric of daily life. And so, slowly at first, and then with powerful momentum, a new idea began to take shape, that the nation could only recover if it learned to stand together. The rise of community solidarity. Long before federal programs gained traction, communities themselves tried to fill the void left by failing banks, shuttered factories, and disappearing farm income. In towns across America, neighbors leaned on each other with a seriousness and intensity rarely seen before or since. Churches set up makeshift food pantries. Local volunteers cooked giant pots of soup that could feed dozens of families at once. Store owners allowed customers to run tabs on credit even when repayment seemed unlikely. Barbers cut hair for free. Farmers shared milk and eggs with those who had nothing left. In the hardest-hit cities, Hoovervilles, shanty towns built from scrap wood, tar paper, cardboard, and rusted metal, sprang up on the outskirts of urban centers. They were named bitterly after President Herbert Hoover, whom many blamed for the severity of the Depression. These settlements became entire shadow communities, complete with streets, improvised churches, communal meals, and makeshift stoves fueled by anything that could burn. People who had once owned homes now lived in shacks, but even here, dignity surfaced in small gestures. A swept dirt floor, a patched curtain, a carefully arranged flower in a tin can. Soup kitchens became one of the most enduring symbols of the era. Lines stretched for blocks in cities like Chicago, New York, and Detroit. Men stood silently with their hands in their pockets, waiting for a bowl of broth and a piece of bread. Some were laborers, some were clerks, some had once been executives in suits. Hunger erased distinctions that once separated people. The fear of starvation, once unimaginable for many middle-class families, became a daily threat. Private charities did what they could, but their resources were overwhelmed. Churches ran out of money. Local governments found their budgets collapsing. The crisis had outgrown the ability of local goodwill to solve it. America needed something unprecedented, a national response equal to the scale of the disaster. The New Deal, a turning point in American life. When Franklin D. Roosevelt took office in 1933, he inherited a country on the verge of collapse. Banks were failing every day. Millions were unemployed with no safety net. Industrial production had fallen by half. And yet, in his first fireside chat, Roosevelt did something no spreadsheet or policy could accomplish. He restored hope. His calm voice crackling through the radio reassured anxious families and gave them the belief that recovery was possible. Roosevelt's New Deal was not a single law or program. It was a sweeping redefinition of government's role in American life. It signaled a shift from every family for itself to a belief that in extraordinary times, the nation must act together. For the first time, federal policy focused not just on banks and business, but on ordinary people. One of the earliest and most urgent tasks was stabilizing the banking system. Many Americans had lost their life savings during bank failures. Roosevelt declared a national bank holiday, temporarily closing banks so the government could inspect and reorganize them. When they reopened, the crisis of confidence had eased. People lined up to redeposit money instead of withdrawing it. It was a small miracle, but it changed the trajectory of the nation. The government also created jobs, not just a few thousand, but millions. The Public Works Administration, PWA, and Works Progress Administration, WPA, hired unemployed Americans to build roads, bridges, schools, post offices, parks, airports, and dams. These were not theoretical projects. They became the backbone of modern America. Every state benefited. A man who hadn't worked in years could suddenly bring home a paycheck again, restoring his pride and stability to his family. For young men particularly hard hit by unemployment, the Civilian Conservation Corps, CCC, offered a lifeline. They lived in camps, planted billions of trees, built trails, fought forest fires, restored eroded land, and sent most of their wages home to support their families. The CCC did more than provide jobs. It gave restless, discouraged young men a sense of purpose and direction. The Agricultural Adjustment Act, AAA, attempted to stabilize farm prices and stop the free fall that had devastated rural communities. Farmers who had lost everything finally saw relief. Rural Electrification Administration, REA programs brought electricity to farming communities that had never had it before, transforming daily life. A new kind of social safety net. Perhaps the most lasting legacy of the New Deal was the creation of a federal safety net. For the first time, the U.S. government accepted responsibility for helping citizens avoid starvation, homelessness, and old age poverty. Social Security was born in this era, a groundbreaking idea that workers could retire with dignity after a lifetime of labor. Unemployment insurance, disability assistance, and aid for vulnerable children all emerged from this defining moment. Not everyone welcomed these changes. Critics argued that government intervention threatened free enterprise. Others believed the programs didn't go far enough. But for millions of Americans, the New Deal was nothing short of salvation. It didn't end the Depression instantly, but it softened its most brutal edges. It gave people time to rebuild, time to recover, time to hope. The migrants who tested America's conscience. The Dust Bowl migrants, the Okies, Arkies, and others, presented one of the greatest challenges to state and local governments. Tens of thousands of exhausted families reached California with nothing but their clothes and a battered truck. Some communities welcomed them, many did not. California officials tried to close borders, fearing the influx of desperate workers. The migrants faced discrimination, low wages, and overcrowded camps. But slowly, conditions began to change. Federal camps built by the Farm Security Administration, FSA, offered clean water, sanitation, education, and a sense of dignity. These camps became the first places where migrant families were treated not as burdens, but as human beings deserving of basic respect. The photographs taken there, children smiling despite the hardship, mothers cooking in communal kitchens, fathers repairing clothes and tools, revealed resilience and grace in the face of overwhelming adversity. These images did more than document suffering. They stirred empathy across the nation. Americans who had never seen a dust storm now felt connected to those who had lost everything. The country began to understand that the Depression was not just an economic failure, but a human story. A nation forever changed. By the late 1930s, the worst of the Depression had eased, though full recovery would not arrive until industrial mobilization for World War II. But America had been transformed. People who once saw government as distant and uninterested now viewed it as a partner. Communities that had relied solely on themselves learned the value of collective action. Families discovered strength within scarcity, courage within fear, and unity within shared struggle. The Great Depression left scars on landscapes, on homes, on families, and on the nation itself. But it also left something far more enduring, a shared understanding that America's greatest strength is not its wealth, but its people. The farmers who rebuilt ruined fields, the workers who laid bricks for new schools, the mothers who kept families together with almost nothing, the migrants who crossed deserts in search of hope, the neighbors who fed each other when they themselves were hungry. When the world seemed cold and indifferent, Americans warmed it with compassion. When systems failed, ordinary people lifted one another up. When despair threatened to overwhelm the country, unity pushed back. The Great Depression was a time of extraordinary darkness, but it also revealed extraordinary light, a light born of endurance, generosity, and the belief that even in the hardest times, no one should have to stand alone.